Listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Oh, stomping Jen.
Are we light? Are we enjoying? We're gonna
I'm not
enjoy.
sure I'm enjoying.
We're gonna be fine.
Yeah, we have been beset by a series of technical difficulties.
Yes.
So it is a miracle, some kind of miracle that we're able to sit here and talk.
Yes.
For this episode. Well, I'm excited.
I am too. I've been looking forward to this all day.
I feel like I have waded through a jungle of adversity to get to be able to talk to this lovely human being this evening. We're going to be talking to Kelsey Hall. She is an accessibility professional, an academic, a leader in her community. We're going to talk to her about all of these things.
I'm excited.
Are you?
Yes, and
Okay.
she's a terrific human being.
Yes, I already said that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
All right.
it is worth repeating.
All right.
Okay,
Let's
you
get
ready?
to it. Yes.
Let's get to it.
The Soft Serve Podcast.
Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. Oh, stomping Jen.
I think you invited the creepy truck here today.
I did invite the creepy truck today.
All right.
Yeah, we don't want any creepy trucks. Get out of here, you. All right, but who we do not want to get out of here is our guest,
Right.
Kelsey Hall. Let's say hi to Kelsey. Hi, Kelsey.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on and persevering through all of the aforementioned technical difficulties.
Yes, you're quite a trooper.
Yeah, I am thrilled to be speaking to you, mostly because I know a little bit about some of the work that you do in this area that we call accessibility. But before we begin talking about accessibility, I just wanted to give you a little chance to tell us more about yourself. Anything you want to add?
Sure. Let's see. I am a Massachusetts native, and I feel like, especially just given the times we're in right now, I haven't spent a lot of time in the last 3 or 4 years really thinking about a whole lot outside of, accessibility and disability. So this whole quarantine has given me a lot of time to focus on creativity, which has been really great. So I've been doing a lot of different art and, hiking a lot. That was, a really big thing we got into this year. So when I'm not focused on disability and accessibility, I'm probably painting or hiking. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me otherwise, but I'm sure we'll find out more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And again, thanks for being with us to have this conversation, which I think is a really important one.
Mm-hmm.
And for the people listening to this who are asking the question, what is accessibility? Could you just answer that?
Yeah. I think the most common thing people are used to kind of engaging with are curb cuts. So the areas of a sidewalk, for example, where there's a little bit drop in the sidewalk where it meets the road. That's a form of accessibility for people who are wheelchair users, but also for people who are on bicycles and all sorts of things. So accessibility really creates an environment where people with disabilities are able to belong and exist and thrive just in the same way that people, or same access, different way that people without disabilities do and can.
And when we think about accessibility, you gave an example. So the curb cut, the sidewalk curb cut, it doesn't necessarily have to be something physical like that in the what I would call the material world. There is this idea about digital accessibility, right? And other, I think, forms of accessibility. Could you talk just a little bit more about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So the physical world is usually the one, the realm that people just generally are most familiar with because it's kind of like in your face and obvious. The digital world is where I mostly spend my time in accessibility. And that has to do with, so there are digital curb cuts as well. So ways that people with different types of disabilities engage with digital spaces, whether it's a mobile app, whether it's a phone, like hardware versus software, a website. And that kind of spans into not just like the actual product itself, but the whole process of creating a product. So design, there's inclusive and accessible design. And there are also, outside of just the digital world, there's even things around accessibility like economic accessibility. So, not everyone is able to afford everything that comes their way. So there's the idea of, in this kind of realm, thinking about accessibility from an economic standpoint as well, because it also carries over into things like digital, which maybe we'll talk about at some point. But so there's a lot of different ways that accessibility kind of comes about. But I do also want to clarify, a lot of people confuse the word accessibility with availability. So this is very much different in a lot of ways. So I'll throw that out there too.
Thanks. And you mentioned disability a couple of times as we were talking about that. In your line of work, could you frame what we mean when we're talking about disability? I think in a lot of people's minds, disability, again, is something that they can easily identify and look at and see and say, there, that person has a disability. And I know from, my limited work in this area, that's not necessarily true. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of disability.
Yeah, absolutely. So disability, when I tend to talk about it and start introducing it to people, I always caveat the idea of disability with, once you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. So anything I say after that means that it is not clear cut. There's so much gray and variability, just like there is among any person or any group of people. So the easiest way that I find to kind of talk about it when considering different types of disabilities that people may experience is to break it into a few categories. And those categories are vision. So someone who has a sight disability, maybe they're blind, maybe they're colorblind, peripheral vision, maybe, they have tunnel vision. It could be any type of vision-based disability. Hearing is another area. So someone who's deaf, hard of hearing, someone with significant tinnitus or an auditory processing disorder, anything to do with the ears. And or the ear-brain connection. The next would be physical. So that's a wide array of different types of disabilities, from someone who may use prosthetics to someone who may use a wheelchair, to someone who may have paralysis. So that's kind of a spectrum. Cognitive, which is also really vast. That really just means brain-based. So it could be someone who has an intellectual disability, or describing someone who has something more like a learning disability, like dyscalculia, so difficulty with math and numbers, or dyslexia, which is more reading, writing. And let's see, what do I have left? Speech. That's another one as well. So someone may have no verbal ability to speak, or it could be someone who maybe has a stutter. There's lots of different types of, or something that we call dyspraxia. So that's a neurological condition with speech. So there's so many different types of disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think I hit them all. Let's see. Vision, hearing, cognitive,
Physical,
what?
and
Physical,
speech. That's
and
5.
speech. That's 5. Yeah. So I tend to break it down into those categories. And then, of course, anyone can have any combination of disability as well. So you might have, a disability type from all of those categories, but that's, of course, a very medical way to look at disability.
Mm-hmm.
But it tends to be a way that helps people understand how broad disability can be and the kind of like different areas that it exists in. And to your point, too, you had mentioned, it's something that people think they can see all the time, but really 80% of disabilities are invisible.
Wow.
So that adds an interesting layer. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really, and thank you for that explanation. And I think that was the point I kind of wanted to try to tease out of that question was I knew that, I knew the vast majority of disabilities can't be seen with the eye. So I'm going to ask a really obvious question here. Why should we, why should we all care about accessibility? Why is this something you have spent a large part of your life working in?
I wish that it was something that would seem kind of silly to ask, but man, I spend so much of that time working in this world convincing people they should care about this that to someone empathic like the two of you, it might seem like a no-brainer, but to much of the world, unfortunately, we're in a very different place when it comes to disability. So it's also really unfortunate that people seemingly have to experience a lot of things to get them to care about it. Because I think that presents a really unique issue in this line of work. Ironically, about 25% of the population has a disability of some kind, but because of the stigma around disability and the rampant ableism that exists in our society, people are unwilling a lot to recognize what disability is even in themselves and to talk about it and to feel comfortable talking about it. So it's not an easy question to answer, and that's really what I spend a lot of time helping people understand is why it's important. And also just, like how to figure out that why for themselves if it's not something that is directly impacting them. But all that aside, we should care about it because it's the world's largest underrepresented group and the only one that anyone can become a part of at any time. So even if it's from a place of pure selfishness, you should care about it because it's very likely that at any moment, at any point in time in your lifetime, actually it's highly probable, you will experience one or multiple disabilities. And so the world just right now isn't built for you, most likely. So you should probably be investing in your future or your current existence that you're unwilling to admit you exist in.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And that was a profound realization to me when somebody framed the pending kind of disability that's waiting for me at some unknown time, right? Like, in addition to the ones I already have, I think I've talked before on this podcast that I suffer from intractable migraine, right? Which is a I don't know if we would put that in the cognitive bucket, but like at some point in my early 20s, I don't remember, I started experiencing these kind of random, unpredictable, life disrupting neurological events that had an impact on my work, on my family life, on my social life, and having that happen to me out of the blue it's not something I ever expected, and I've been kind of dealing with now for 25 years or so. But but that whole thinking about disability in that way, it's just I think is a really important thing for people to do. Like, you may be walking around in this world right now in your own mind, okay, but tomorrow anything could be waiting for any of us, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, how how did you get involved in accessibility work? What drew you into this?
Yeah. And that's something I think about a lot. It's like what drew me in and what keeps me here. I think about this because many, many, many years ago, so like 30 years ago, I was in preschool and my mom ran an after school program for kind of like the preschool, kindergarten, and through, I think it was like 8th grade, where I was and where my brother was. And as part of that program, she had a person who was deaf come in and teach American Sign Language. And I took that class, and I continue to take that class and classes like that forever. I literally took it and had some time on and off. And so I started kind of getting into this world unknowingly. And it kind of just took me in a lot of different directions. And it has continued to over time. So I met so many different people in the deaf community from when I was young to when I was like a teenager to then as an adult. And within that also kind of broadened the world of disability as a whole for me. And I started meeting more people and then realizing, well, I have family members who have disabilities. And this is where the like socio-cultural side of this is so fascinating to me, is like, I didn't recognize disability in my family as what it is and the way that it is until much later, because it's like almost like it's ingrained ableism, right? But it's also just no one wanting to talk about it, which is also, ingrained ableism. So, I started realizing all of these things, finding out about all of these things and talking about them more and going through various education. And it's just kind of my educational path, my personal path. Just so many different places have taken me just within the world of disability. And I'm so grateful in so many ways because I have learned so much from people all over the world in totally different, cultures and societies about disability, how they view it, how they view themselves, how the medical systems versus society's systems kind of view disability, and what's good and what's not so good about that. And it's fascinating. And I have my own disabilities that have kept me here. And it's a world that is like simultaneously the most humane, and the most intersectional and the most oppressed in many ways because of that intersectionality.
You mentioned other countries that grapple with this. Are there places that are in the world that are doing it right in your mind, or better than we are?
It's tricky. I would say yes in some ways. I wouldn't say like there's any one particular country that this is a tricky one because one depends on how you measure it. So if we're talking strictly me and how I would measure success in this, there's no one country that does any one part of this quote unquote right to me, because there are countries that favor certain types of disabilities or will listen more loud, listen more clearly to certain types of disability populations. I don't find that any one country really looks at disability holistically and the impact it has on education, society, on employment, on just like general well-being. So, I actually would say no. Like in the US, you're more apt to find people who are going to use their rights and use litigation to get what they need. But in a lot of ways, that's not a win for many people either, because it often will only get the bare minimum. So I don't really think there is a particular country that I think is doing right by the widest array of people with disabilities.
That is so disheartening. I know. I often
that may just bring us down.
No, it's not in that way. I just mean like I often think I think the US is so big and it's so imperfect, right? It's easier, I think, sometimes to see what we want modeled in a given area in smaller, kind of tighter countries, I guess. And the fact that, you know, you can't point to a place to me, and say, you know, they're kind of doing it right? Like, or this is the model we should be striving for, like, is heartbreaking to me in a way. Like that more people aren't concerned about accessibility and disability. And you use the word a couple times, ableism, that ableism is kind of like systemic across the world. And could you talk to us a little bit about ableism and what that is and what that means when you say that word?
Yeah. In its purest form, ableism means discrimination in favor of people without disabilities. So what might be said as able-bodied people. So discrimination against people with disabilities, and that can be really explicit and that can be really implicit. So it could be something as obvious as refusing, so going back to those curb cuts, refusing to put curb cuts, you know, on a sidewalk because it changes the aesthetic of the sidewalk when that impacts a person's ability to get by, right? So that's explicit ableism, just saying, no, absolutely not. You're, you know, useless. Implicit could be those little comments. So in the digital world, a good example that carries over from curb cuts as like a, you know, a person trying to go the aesthetic route and deciding they will absolutely refuse to create an accessible anything, entryway, etc. In the digital world, you'll often hear people say things like, well, is that like a must-have or is that a nice to have if you're talking about products or, you know, like the development of a feature for a product? And that probably enrages me more than anything, because it's not as explicit as like blatantly denying someone's rights. But if I were in the digital space to need a certain color contrast available on a web page someone's designing, and the proposed, you know, design doesn't meet that, and I say we need to change that contrast, you might get back, is that a nice to have or a must have? And it's like, nothing's really a nice to have if it impedes someone's access. So there's a lot of different explicit and implicit, and those are just like really vague examples off the top of my head, but there's so many more. How do
you deal with those situations? Like when you're clearly faced with somebody who doesn't even see the need, right, for being inclusive in their design. Like when they ask that question, how do you answer? I mean, I'm assuming this happens in a professional context, and you most of the time, and you can't rip off somebody's head and throw it across the room when they say these sorts of things. But like, walk us through how you might address a situation like that.
Honestly, part of it depends on how my day's been and where I'm at in that moment. Sometimes I can be a lot more aggressive. And you know what? There are times that it honestly warrants it because people need to wake up a bit. So I can't say that I'm uber professional all the time in my responses for things, but I usually bring it back to if someone's making a comment about something, like I've had people say, why would we do that for those people? It costs so much money. And usually my response immediately is, would you put that on LinkedIn? Would you type that out on LinkedIn? Would you put this whole conversation with you as who you are saying that? If the answer is no, then you shouldn't be saying it here. You probably shouldn't be thinking it either. So we need to like work on several things. I'm pretty adamant about my responses being really clear. I'm trying to get people to think about, if I wouldn't say that, why wouldn't I say that? You know, there's also things too, like if someone doesn't have access to something on your mobile app, right? And you were to say something like, you might hear a more implicit thing like, oh, well, you know, those people don't use it anyway. Like thinking about people with disabilities, and, you know, I have plenty of comments for that, but you would never say like, oh, disabled people don't use it anyway, so we're not going to do it because it's extra. You would never say, oh, Asian people don't use it anyway, so we're not going to do anything for them. Like, you would never, or women don't use it, so we're not going to do anything. You would never replace that disabled with any other population that's underrepresented or discriminated against. And you'll find a really big challenge with grappling with the ability to say that. But suddenly it's okay for disability to be included in that conversation. So it's very strange to me. But it's something we call out. I call out, people I work with call out, the community calls out because we have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are people like, I'm assuming anyone who would say something like that is probably ignorant of the reasons why, right? Do people tend to be receptive to hearing that they need to kind of change the way they're thinking about accessibility in their own, ableist kind of points of view?
It's a good question, because I think part of why I say we because I feel like I'm not talking on behalf of the disability profession, like accessibility professional community, but I do feel there's a collective understanding that there's a lot of the work that I do is technical in nature because I'm on the digital accessibility side. But I really believe that more like 90% of the work I do comes down to education. But it's really hard to educate people when they can't get on par with you that they need to be educated. So I've always found that a comment like, would you put that on LinkedIn? And then working through, well, no, like the response is always going to be like, I don't know why, and then working through like, well, why wouldn't you put that on LinkedIn? What does that say? Would you replace this word with another underrepresented? And like walking them through that conversation gets them engaged in like thinking about, oh, why am I saying this? Where is this coming from? And then it offers the in to kind of educate, knowingly or unknowingly sometimes, but I find much more success doing it that way and kind of bringing to light the inherent ableism, giving it a name, and then requesting something of them to change that, which would be then educating, meaning that color contrast thing I brought up. I might bring up a color contrast simulator to say, the reason why I'm asking this is because this is what this might look like to someone who can't, interact with that color scheme you're presenting. And it offers those opportunities to kind of provide the why. And hopefully with that information where they're like, oh my gosh, I'm second guessing my own belief system. Simultaneously, I'm understanding how this is a problem. The hope is that they'll find their way to have a seat at the table to start doing some work in the ableism area, anti-ableism area.
Yeah. That anti-ableism, is that just trying to put into place policies and practices that actively resist ableist practices and policies and beliefs, or is it something else? Can you tell us a little bit more about anti-ableism? Yeah,
I think it is that, but I think it's also a lot more of kind of calling out ableism in action to get just like a lot of these other kind of movements that we're seeing in light of this, a lot of stuff for many years that are kind of coming to light and coming to head, especially in this year, more broadly and more obviously. It's thinking about a lot of these populations of people and how we're actively standing up for them and with them to fight back. And a lot of that does come to policy, but people on the ground who are experiencing this every day may not directly, impact policy in the way that you might be like, people might be thinking at home, like, we're sitting there writing these laws and blah, blah, blah. But it's small movements, it's community movements. It's it's also like large movements. Like I work for a large corporation. Part of the work that I see as anti-ableist is immediately inserting images of people with disabilities for, big campaigns that are getting pushed through, whether or not they've been approved. So it's like all of these types of things where you're like, oh, actually, we're going to just do this. And I'm just going to do it because I'm in a position where I can do it. Or, so some of it's more, yes, policy and organized in that way. But policy's only got the U.S. in particular so far. If anything, it's in some ways held us back. So And I think there's a lot of really great stuff happening on social media now that people have a platform to be able to start kind of speaking out against these things. And doing things that like really disrupt people's thoughts about what people with disabilities look like and how they should or should not interact. And there's a lot of great people to follow on social media that I can definitely mention and shout out at some point too.
Yeah.
Like what? Shout it out.
Like who? Like what?
Shout it out.
So on Instagram, there's a lot of really, really great people. Some of the people that I follow, like I want to make sure that I have their handles right, because one person is Wheelchair Rapunzel, but I feel like there's a period between Wheelchair and Rapunzel. So I'll definitely I'll have to send you all of these people, but I follow her because she's an individual. She's in a wheelchair. She's a wheelchair user, a power wheelchair user, because people with power wheelchairs are even that much less represented in the world. And she is really working super hard to help people understand that people with disabilities, disabled people, are sexy too, no matter what their body looks like. It really challenges well, why do you think that certain body types are better than others? And it's kind of, she's just out there just living her life like any other Instagram mid-late 20s woman or individual, just kind of just being sexy. And I think it's just great because it needs to be out there. Like this conversation needs to happen. People with disabilities, disabled people have sex and think about sex. And I think it needs to be talked about more. So she's someone I love to follow. And then there is a comedian from Britain, and he won, Britain's Got Talent, I think is what it is. And his handle is Lost Voice Guy. And he uses an augmentative communication device, which is basically, he has cerebral palsy. And so his speech is more difficult to understand. So he uses a speech generating device. Yep. And he's hilarious. He's a comedian, super funny, super great to follow, has awesome jokes. Not all of his jokes are about disabilities because he's much more than just disability. So he's super fun to follow as well. There's a lot of really great people. And I don't know if people were following, trying to make sure that I have names right. But if people have been following the news lately, there is a woman named Lizzie Velasquez, and she was in the news recently, maybe, what is time? Yesterday was January. Maybe like in the middle of summer. And she has a genetic disorder. And there's an awful, super ableist TikTok thing going on where, it was right before the start of school, because they were taking her photo and they were passing that around and on TikTok, and parents were showing her photo to their children and saying, "This is your teacher for the new year."
Oh, I remember
and it was a picture
that.
of her. Oh, it was awful. It was absolutely absurd. It was so, I want to say that I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised because of how awful our society is. And so she has worked super hard to raise awareness about disability, physical differences, and she's incredible to follow. So her name's Lizzie Velasquez, and I think her handle's like Little Lizzie, or Little Lizzie V. She's awesome. So she's a great advocate to follow too.
Yeah, and if you want to send us the list of those, we can drop them in the show notes for people.
I will.
I remember that whole thing that they were doing with remote learning school kids, like showing them pictures of people that we're supposed to believe, like you said, have something wrong with them or should be scary to children, and it was disgusting. Exactly. It was absolutely disgusting and vile.
Then there was the whole.
It was disgusting.
There's so many different examples that you can point to, like the witches and the hands that they manipulated
and the feet.
Yeah,
I'm unfamiliar with that.
So,
The show The Witches? I think I'm remembering now, maybe.
Is it a show? I thought it was a movie.
Or a movie, maybe.
It was a movie. Yeah, the movie they just redid with Anne Hathaway.
Yeah, so her character in the book, the witches just have like claw-like hands.
Okay.
But they like chose to make it so that she had like 2 fingers or something. But it's like an actual disorder that people actually have.
Okay.
Where they only have like 2 fingers on their hands or something.
Yeah.
And so people got really upset. And she had to end up apologizing or whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because like I think about people with mental disorders and accessibility issues.
What do you think about that?
Well, like there's this woman, Penelope Trunk, who is, I think she's got Asperger's, but she's like also like some like high-powered consultant. She writes these blogs and she has like a lot of followers. You know what I'm talking about? Penelope Trunk.
No, I don't think so. Unless, not if she's a consultant. I thought you were going to be talking about a different movie thing that's going on, but no, keep going.
No, it's not a movie.
Well, I think something like Asperger's is like, something like that is interesting to me because like people, like there's an element, right, that I think people latch on to, and sometimes people with Asperger's like demonstrate something that people can attach value to, that they recognize, like super math skills, or they're really knowledgeable,
attention to detail.
Yeah. And then we say, oh, that element of your disability is valuable to me. Therefore, you are, you now have more intrinsic value as a human being. And that
exactly,
that's something I've always thought is just kind of gross in a way, the way we, you know what I mean? Like
a very capitalist way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. The way we can focus on like elements of a person, find value in just those things and say, you're worth something because, now you're worth something because this one thing you can do has value to me. Like, I don't know. Sorry. I don't know if that was where you were going.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's where I was going. I'm just thinking about other examples of the invisible disabilities for accessibility. Like, what was that book? So David Sedaris's brother who wrote that book.
Oh, Running with Scissors?
No. Augustin Burroughs. No, that was Augustin Burroughs.
Augustin Burroughs.
No, the brother of a writer who wrote, his name was Bill something.
Okay.
And he had some autism or something.
I know Augustin Burroughs' brother had Asperger's, and he wrote a book.
Yeah. I'm just bringing examples of things. I don't know. It's just associative content.
There's so many. There's so many. And then I think about
and then I think about kids in school that have IEPs, and then the teachers have to, all the special education stuff. I'm just thinking of examples of invisible accessibility issues. I'm just listing out things.
Okay.
I'm free associating here.
Okay.
You should rein us back in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sawtooth.
Well,
and Kelsey.
You mentioned education, right?
Yeah.
And I want to ask our expert here. So a wise person I know framed education for me in some ways like a corporation designed to engage in ableism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And it kind of actually relates a little bit to what you just said too, around the value of a person and how people determine that. I mean, and it kind of relates to what Jen was saying too about, trying to figure out, in schools when kids are young, ableism and how we frame disability starts the second we've decided as a medical community to say that someone has a disability. So whether it's the second a child's born, or whether you acquire a disability or you've had a disability and you just learn about it, but the second that someone slaps a medical name on it, and really I should just quickly distinguish between a medical condition and a disability. So like you were mentioning before around migraines, right? So that's technically a medical condition, but it disables you in many ways, right? It can cause challenges socially. It can cause difficulties for you cognitively, organizationally, probably. So that's also a really important thing to think about is what do we actually mean by disability? But anyway, coming back, and education is so fascinating to me because, man, so background, I am a speech language pathologist and I am a teacher of the deaf. I worked in K-12 and in early intervention and in community transition and in higher education for about 13 years in total. And I recently, as in a couple of years ago, which is wild to think about, made a transition from public education to corporate. And so now I've kind of had these like different experiences. And for so long, I was so ingrained in thinking that education was the more like wholesome place to be, I guess, or the place where you felt like in some ways protected from all the crap of the world, and that you felt like people would be really progressive and thinking about things in a really great way. And honestly, it wasn't until I worked in higher education that I realized how so not true that really all is. And I mean, like some stuff in K-12, but and then even now moving into corporate, I think I realized how even less true that reality is, that education holds this sort of beacon of light and truth. I think it's a whole bunch of crap. And if I really had thought of this earlier, I probably myself maybe never would have gone to higher education. So I think the second that we've determined that essential value of someone, that they have a disability or a disabling quote unquote condition, medical condition, we place barriers in their way every step of the way, whether we do it actually explicitly or we do it implicitly. In education, when you start off in K-12, or even before then, even before you get to kindergarten, if you were born with a certain type of disability, you may qualify for early intervention, which tells you and your family there's something wrong with you, essentially, and that we need specialists to come in to help fix it and to help your parents help continue to fix it. And then we realize that some things can't be quote unquote fixed. So then we push kids into schooling. And this IEP, this individualized education plan, follows them, that calls out every area of their challenges and difficulties. It lays them all out and it sets these goals to kind of work towards overcoming them, I guess. I really question so many of these pieces now. And then all these professionals who have been trained. So this is where the systemic issue comes in. I mean, it's been here the whole way. So the medical world meets the educational world, meets the specialist world, where my speech pathology education was rampant with ableism. How we talked about people, how we diagnosed people, how we evaluated people, how we provided therapy. And this all follows these students, and it helps them in a not so great way most of the time determine who they are and what value they hold. And they carry that with them forever. And it starts in education. So I don't know if you want to interject before I keep going on my rampage over here.
No, I like the thing that was popping into my mind is as I was hearing you talk was like these people, these administrators, these systems, obviously to me think they're helping, right? They're trying to help. And how do we reframe that? How do we reframe that approach to not doing more damage? How do we?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I think a prime example of that is standardized testing. We're telling these children they need to meet a certain threshold to be okay.
Yeah.
Which is not every kid
to have value. Yeah.
Right. Not every kid can get there, and it's they put a lot of pressure on these kids.
And for me, it's not even about not every kid can get there, right? It's about we have set up these artificial benchmarks by which we measure people's value,
right.
like your ability to get a fucking 800 on
SAT.
your English part of your SAT or your math. Like, I mean, it goes to so much in society where we've now, we now hold value in desk jobs as opposed to vocational work, which is a bunch of baloney and malarkey because like I can't sew a button on a pair of pants. Like, I feel like I missed out on so many opportunity to learn other things because it's drilled in these schools to, go to college and get a degree and blah, blah, blah bullshit. And I don't know. And I'm thinking, Kelsey, like, I think it starts even before K through 12, right? Like it's that
early intervention, birth.
It's like that doctor or that whoever who says
100%.
your child who, may look differently, because they were born with, a genetic condition that causes their body to look different. They're,
here's like a minutia example of like a pretty, I think, common, maybe potentially problem. Like when we had our son and he had issues breastfeeding and they told us he was tongue tied and that we should cut his have a frenectomy on him. And, that it would impact his speech later on in life. He gave us like up and down the list of like why we should have this procedure done on him. And I was just like, but I can pump my milk, give it to him and he'll be fine. So why can't I just do that? So we made that decision not to do it.
Yeah, it is interesting. The medical community and the breastfeeding community was very invested in convincing us there was something wrong with our child, right? Like, and like for all the reasons Jen just said, like he was going to encounter, a terrible life filled with obstacles, and we better be prepared for it if we don't cut his tongue, part of his tongue off. And
I was like, and we were just horrified. We were like, we don't want to do that. That's just like,
So I guess where I was going with that is I think it probably starts. There are other ableist systems like the the medical and
everywhere.
No offense to the medical community. We have doctors in our family, but it's these systemic isms, right? That get enculturated into societies, and they're hard to flush out and get rid of. So.
Because they're built into policies, they're built into education, right? Like when I talk about the medical education, it's like, it's not about having a fence towards the medical community. It's about maybe they need to start questioning their own education a bit more in certain areas. Like how do we get people to do that? Speech pathology in my program, rampant with ableist ideas and othering and fear and ensuring that we can kind of like write certain kids or certain people or fix them. It's this idea of fixing, which is really messed up when you really think about it. And I think, one time that it really hit me was I had a student with autism when I was working as a speech pathologist in a high school. And it hit me how intensely this is ingrained in families as well, like parents. Because this child had been through the whole system with an IEP his whole life. His mother was really deeply ingrained in the disability community from a parenting family standpoint, and was actually someone at the time that I really looked up to from a family perspective. And so I was working with her son on social communication skills. He was like 17 at the time. And it was really fascinating because in a lot of ways, I had just seen him making progress in not so much the way of like, making lots of different friends or et cetera, but he had a lot of friends and he had really certain like specific interests. And I remember sitting at a table with her during an IEP meeting, and she said she was very upset because he hadn't made the progress that she wanted. He hadn't made friends that she wanted him to make, all of these things, listing off all of this. And I just remember looking at her and being like, who do you want him to be? Like, he's here and he has friends, he has hobbies, he has interests. They might not be your desired hobbies and interests or the friends you want him to have, but do you want him to be a frat boy or do you want him to just be who he is? Because I don't intend to fix him to make him like a bro. Like it's just not my plan. So I just remember sitting there and just being like, oh my gosh, even this person who has had so much training on anti-ableism, on neurodiversity, on all of this, is sitting here in this conversation with me about her son and literally basically begging him to be fixed. And I'm like, but fixed like who? Why is this kid over here on the football team your go-to for an ideal?
Right.
He's not very interesting. Your son is super interesting. He's a great kid. Like, it was just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Poor kids.
Yeah, that must be really difficult to have to face day in and day out as somebody doing that work. What do you do when you go home and you like, what do you do?
Oh man.
Do you just cry? Like, is that, yeah.
I mean, it makes me think a lot about the people in my family with different disabilities and their ages and what happened with them kind of growing up and going through these systems that were ill-equipped to even talk about this. And how they've kind of gotten where they are and what they're doing and how they kind of see their sense of self and where like these kids are today. I think the benefit that kids have today is just like looking at like having social media in many ways that it's so wrong. At least they have role models to kind of look up to and think about. So I have hope in that regard. Yeah. I also have a lot of hope just in like, in the community itself. Like I love this community. There's so much to be learned and so much fun to be had. And I try to focus on those things, but man, therapy does a lot of wonders. And I highly recommend it. And just surrounding yourself with people that get it, I guess, and really are willing to talk about it and to listen, even if they don't get it, to when you need to talk about it. And not just superficially, because this is layered. This is like built into the fabric of our society. And, even myself, I find that I'm constantly unpacking things that I've learned inherently about, like because of ableism in my everyday life and existence. That's just like constant. So it's just also this culture of just calling each other out in like the most loving and caring way when you're a part of this community, but also with like really expecting that people are willing to face it and move forward. So, and drink water, all the LaCroix.
Yes. Drink water, drink water and therapy. Both things we're huge. Yeah. We're both huge proponents of that.
That's true. We can get behind those.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience in the corporate world versus K through 12 and higher education. Is it a money issue in your mind, or is there something else going on here? Like, and I have no knowledge of what happens in the corporate world. So this question's coming from a place of ignorance. I'll confess that. Like in my mind though, I would assume corporations might be driven by fear of being sued, right? And they have the money, right, to engage in the work around this. Or, I mean, course correct me here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Here's the really interesting thing. Education has the money. They just don't care enough to allocate it where it needs to go. I say that because technically education is also backed by the federal government. There's a lot of funds that are available. The federal government also has certain laws that higher education, K-12, have to abide by. And there's no reasonable reason to not do so. So when higher education, for example, accepts funding from the government, state, federal, et cetera, they also are signing off saying that that money will be used to do things like provide certain supports and services to those who need it, to provide accessible technologies, to procure services and supports that are accessible in nature, but they don't do that. And they don't do that, and they perpetuate a cycle of ableism and inaccessibility, and they don't seem to care. In a lot of places, they don't seem to care. I think that there's actually not much difference between corporate and higher education in particular, except that there's more freedom, quote unquote, in the framework when you hit something like corporate. I wouldn't say that there's actually all that much more money on the offset. The interesting part is, though, however, is that this is what I was saying before, that in some ways, like being bound by these federal and state laws, this is a deeper conversation, but being bound by certain federal and state laws means that you actually more so have the fear of being sued. Higher ed, to me, has the fear of being sued so on the forefront of their mind, they can't even see people with disabilities as people. In corporate, you have a different kind of set of laws that you're supposed to adhere to. They aren't as specific or as, they're much more nuanced in nature. So although there's always a fear for anyone getting sued anywhere, I think the reality is that if you're in a large corporation, you have a target on your back no matter what. So that's not really anything new to you. Like using the "we might get sued" card isn't really, it's not that it's good. It's not good, but it's also not something to necessarily be super fearful of, because it doesn't shock anyone.
Right.
So I think, and having the law be your driving force is the number one thing that will keep you back from progress, because you still don't see people with disabilities or disabled people as people. And that causes a whole slew of problems in its own. So I am reflecting on this frequently lately, because of these two worlds that I've been in different ways. And corporate has been much more freeing, and it's been much easier to use my voice without fear, which I can talk about if you're interested as well. Despite not having like the really amazing backings of something like a union, you know?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
That is fascinating. Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah.
That helped crystallize some things for me. I mean, we both have wandered the hallowed halls of higher education, and one of the things you constantly hear is crying poor, right? Like we have no money. We have no money for that. How are we going to do that? You know, like, and you're right. The money's there.
Oh yeah.
The money's there.
I have a whole other problem with how it's spent. Yeah. That's like a whole other bird. It's like how it's spent, but also don't even get me started on sports, but that's a whole other ballgame.
Yeah. And sorry, the thing I want to clarify is the crying poor is usually done by the administrators who are not doing the work of trying to support people in higher education. It's, you know, those people who are on the ground doing their damn best to do this work and help people, you know, they are rightfully pointing out that they don't have funding, right? But the administrators are making the claims that they don't have the money being allocated to them for this. And my sense is it's a lack of will, you know. I don't know. Maybe you could talk more about that.
And desire.
Yeah.
But man, it also comes back to this idea that people with disabilities aren't worthy.
Yeah.
So like it just like points directly to that, because if they saw value and worth in people and disabled students, then certainly there would be money filtered there. People shouldn't have to experience something to find value in it, but for whatever reason they do. So like when you look at the CEO of Microsoft, right? He has two children or three children with disabilities. And Microsoft has the biggest push for any corporation anywhere to include disabled people across every facet of their organization in every single way. And where do you think that came from? Like, yes, it came from the hardworking people on the ground every day being like, this matters. But then it also came from a CEO being like, oh, I know this matters and I care about this, and we are going to fund this because this is also what's going to keep our society moving.
Right.
And of course there are problems with Microsoft, but there's problems with everything, but it's a step in it's a big step, a big series of steps in a direction under leadership that does happen to value people with disabilities, because he lives with people who are disabled every single day and they're his children.
Yeah.
So
right. It's about
his why is easy.
Right. The culture that you cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I mean, you mentioned
but
sports.
you don't build that out of legal stuff,
right.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Sports.
What
about it?
Sports versus the arts. You know, the age-old thing that is prevalent in schools across this country, you know, and, you know, and this pandemic, like, you know, it highlights so much of these indiscrepancies between things, you know, like I know a woman who was, you know, very, very upset about school this year, you know, that it's remote and that the athletics programs were, you know, oh, the kids need to play sports, you know, but her kid's not a sport-minded child. He is in band, and he, you know, they were like, what about the band program? What about music and arts and theater? And, you know, they don't, you know, it's just the mindset, you know, that we, you know, how much do athletes get paid? Why is sports so important in this country that there are restaurants, 1 out of every 6 restaurants are failing in this country because they are not able to operate, but, you know, the athletics program, the NFL and you know.
Right. So that's like exactly like the money is there.
Right.
This is not for lack of money.
Right.
This is a lack of determining the worth of people based on their whether or not they have validity or worth, right? Like the money is always there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's another, and help correct me if I'm wrong. Again, I ask a lot of these questions out of ignorance, right? In my mind, there's a lot of money to be made, or at least work to be generated from assuming people with disabilities are different enough to need all of that, right? Like especially in K through 12, right? Like it gives people work to do, to say these people are so different that they have to have
Absolutely.
IEPs, they have to be in special, you know, classes. Like I feel like there's some kind of nefarious capitalist engine behind this.
So capitalist.
Am I crazy thinking that way?
No, because then also think about like the pharmaceutical industry and how desperately they're trying to eradicate disability or use certain, of course, there are certain disabilities that require pharmaceutical support. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But like, there's plenty of different things that are problematic in these different communities. Yes. Like, just thinking about, we essentially, to your point, we make money off of ensuring that people with disabilities kind of stay flat, that they go from, you know, early intervention directly into K-12, directly into a community service or community transition program, and then directly into, you know, like maybe higher education, but that's never really like pushed. And is that because our higher education is ill-equipped to support people and ensure that they have what they need? I mean, yeah, but should that be a reasonable reason for that? Absolutely not. Like, so it's like all this like cyclical, and then the employment issue, right? The fact that a large majority of people with disabilities, disabled people, are under or not employed at all, and how we perpetuate that, just like in higher ed, by procuring things that are inaccessible to a variety of different people who use different technologies, by creating inaccessible workplaces, by certain attitudes and culture, right? All of these things feed into one another, and it creates this like snowball effect. And it all kind of, if you look across like that whole span, right? It starts with that doctor and it goes all the way through the lifespan and just right back again. It's like this sick, disgusting cycle of like how to keep people flat and just push them through instead of just like allowing them to just live their lives and belong just as anyone else that we'd hope would feel like they belong.
Yeah.
There's a huge capitalist advantage to ensuring that people from underrepresented populations stay that way. And disability is no different, unfortunately.
I don't know why now I'm thinking about that movie we saw the other night. The Sound of Metal.
Sound of Metal. Yeah, are you familiar with that?
One?
It's
Is that a new one?
Yeah, it stars
Is it by Sia?
Riz Ahmed, and he plays a rock musician who suddenly, like basically overnight, loses his hearing, and he has to, and it's funny, it touches on a lot of what we're talking about here. He, spoiler alert, people, this has been out a couple of weeks, but I think it's important to talk about this actually. I'm connecting some dots now that we've talked about this. So he immediately says, I have no place in this world now. I'm a musician. I've lost my hearing.
He tries to fix it.
Right. And he goes to try to get implants. Right. And the cochlear implant industry and doctors like push him really hard and say, this is going to fix all your problems. And he latches onto that, like, cause he says, like, now I am broken. I need this. I have to live my life the way it has been lived all along. I don't have the value I used to have because I lost my hearing. And then he engages with a...
he's also an addict.
He's also an addict. Right. So he engages with a deaf community.
Like a recovery.
Like a recovery deaf community. They teach him sign language. He stays there for a while, but then he sneaks out and he gets these cochlear implants. And then he is like absolutely surprised that they're actually... They don't do what they were promised to do. They don't they don't return him
back to the way he was.
Yeah.
And then he's faced with some really hard like choices about like, who am I?
His identity.
Yeah.
Basically.
What is my value in this world? And I don't know. It was such a good movie.
Yeah.
Now that we've spoiled it for you, go and watch it.
No.
We said, oh, sorry.
I would totally watch it. I hadn't heard of it. I'm so bad with movies and TV shows, but yeah.
No, this was definitely worth watching. I'd love to get your take on it after you've seen it.
I mean, it sounds like it. There's so much. Like, I will also say, like, it's always important. I remember when I was going through my speech pathology degree, I had already seen this series of movies called The Sound and the Fury from my teacher of the deaf program as like a warning. And then I saw it when I was going through my audiology courses for my speech pathology degree. They showed it again. And I was like, this is a really messed up series of movies that follows a family, a deaf, capital D deaf, which is like deaf culture, born deaf into a deaf family. Sign language is their native language family, who had a child who was born, and they were kind of like pushing to get, like the hearing family around them was trying to push them to get cochlear implants for their child, even though the child was deaf and born into a deaf family. And it followed them through this whole process. And in the second movie, the child ends up getting cochlear implants. And then at the very end of the movie, you let the credits roll. The Cochlear Implant Foundation sponsored the movie. So always check who's, exactly.
Were these documentaries?
So always check.
Were these documentaries? Yeah. I think I saw those.
Yeah. They're painful in a lot of ways. Heart-wrenching almost, just because you could really when you watch it, who is really questioning this and and you wonder how much they paid off certain people to do certain things. And it just kind of breaks your heart.
Yeah. And why did I just forget the name of the movie we were talking about? The Sound of Metal. Yeah. A big part of it though, focuses on, he gets kind of paired up, the guy who runs this, deaf drug recovery program, has a couple conversations with him though about you have to understand that your deafness is not the problem. That's the focus. That's the approach of the movie. It's deafness isn't the problem. It's, excuse me, it is the ableist system that you as a hearing person participated in that makes you view this as a problem,
Right.
as the problem.
Yep.
And until you
Exactly.
grapple with that, until you're gonna be chasing the next cochlear implant, like
Right.
forever. And
Yep.
like, it's so touching. Like it just, I don't know. I'm coming at it from a very
And it does.
naive perspective too, but I loved it.
No,
it's so important, and it also gets to the heart of the really interesting thing where like ableism is even rampant in some ways in the disability community as well, right? Like there's a lot of people who within the disability community who struggle to kind of see outside of their own disability and give worth to other people's different types of like it's rampant in our society. And just the fact that you're, born into a society, if you were born with your disability, that views you inherently as less able and less worthy. You have some really interesting ableist ideas just ingrained in you, even if you have a disability. But it's really fascinating to kind of like when you're listening to the conversation happen about people who, like, if you ever get into more of a philosophical conversation with people who are disabled, one of the really interesting things that comes up, depending on who you're talking to, is this idea of what is disabled, right? So, like, if you're born with a disability, are you really disabled? Like, putting the medical stuff aside, right? Medical conditions and all that aside, are you really disabled? You're disabled by society and how it's built, but are you disabled if you're born with it? Because you don't know any different, right? Like that's
Right.
your existence. Even if you're born into an ableist society with all of these problems that exist and how the world has been built to not fit you or to not allow you to feel like you belong, you're still born with that. And that's just like inherently who you are, versus in a situation where someone is born able-bodied, quote unquote, without a disability, and then experiences a disability. So like this person that you're talking about, right? He was hearing his whole life. He has a situation that causes him to not be able to hear anymore. So there's often like these debates going back and forth being like, he actually is quote unquote disabled because he had something and lost it and didn't know any other way to experience, like to find worth in himself, which goes back to that idea of like internalized ableism. But it is really interesting to have that conversation of like, if you're like, what is disability? Like, what does it really mean? And how do people who experience disability differently experience the idea of disability?
Yeah.
If you get what I'm saying.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for some reason I'm thinking back to, I don't know, like a decade or so ago, I was reading a lot about migraines and history of migraines and reading books about migraines. And one particular book I was reading was telling me, I forget which one, but about an indigenous culture that treated people who experienced migraines, especially the kind I have that involve visual auras, as being spiritually enlightened people. Like
The
like,
Hmong?
I'm not sure who it. I'm not sure.
The Hmong?
Maybe I'm totally blanking, but like I'm not bringing it up just because I experience migraines, and I think that I'm enlightened.
Yes,
but
you're enlightened.
but it's about how the culture, right,
Yeah.
views that particular thing, right, and
Absolutely.
so I don't know. I thought that was interesting. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to. Those people in that culture were venerated, like, but not necessarily above other people. There was just a place for them in that particular manifestation of being. Like, that's how I want to say it. Like that way of being in the world.
There's a really interesting book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And it kind of goes through the lives of this Hmong family who had a child who was disabled. And I can't exactly remember what the disability specifically or the medical condition that they had was, but it did cause, I believe, like a significant amount of seizures. And I remember they had moved to the US. And of course, I mean, regardless of what anyone thinks, like the family believed that their child kind of like had this particular relationship with their God, and that these seizures were this idea of enlightenment. And, the seizures were causing also damage to the brain and all sorts of things. And so moving to the US, of course, the culture here saw the family not actively seeking medical support as neglect, but in their culture, that's just kind of how they worked through this child's experience. And it does really become super fascinating about how culture, dictates policies, dictates your medical decisions, dictates all of these things, and how, like this child could have been suffering physically. I don't obviously know this family, and I only read the story from a certain particular account, but it does really get super interesting when you start thinking about culture and how it impacts certain decisions and how someone's viewed, and what their worth is, because the worth of this child was incredibly high. But from the outside looking in, from a U.S. perspective, they were neglectful parents who obviously didn't care about their child. And it's like, but I mean, what would a U.S. parent have done? Maybe seek medical attention and then thrown them in a life skills classroom where they played with Play-Doh all day when they could have been doing something totally more stimulating and interesting else. I don't know. So like, who's right? Who knows? No one? I don't know. What
is our path for confronting ableism, right? Is it adopting a mindful anti-ableist perspective? Like we have, it's not like the way to combat racism is through anti-racism, right? And it is naming the thing and working against it, educating people, like help. Is it the same here for ableism?
It's very similar. They're really fast. What's really interesting too is like there's so many intersections with this. I was talking to a person at work recently who asked if I wanted to leave a certain diversity initiative, right? Focused on Black women in corporate and in technology. And I was like, yeah, like not me just lead it specifically, but on a team if I wanted to be a part of it. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to be a part of this. This is really important. I'm working on my own anti-racism work and in groups and on my own. And so this is a really great way to kind of help support that for myself and for others. Sure. And then immediately I was like, can we talk a little bit about how disability is a part of this conversation? I'm assuming that's also why you want me to be here. And she was like, oh no, we're just talking about Black women. And I was like, well, Black women have disabilities too. I don't understand. And she was just kind of like, oh my God. Like, I didn't even think it was like the light bulb went off, and it was just so fascinating to me. And it just really gets to the heart of the issue that people with disabilities aren't even considered people. So it's really hard to move forward with any type of progress until people can recognize disabled people as people. So we have to really actively, be anti-ableist, really start being willing to like unpack every single piece of anti-ableist rhetoric that we're used to hearing about the worth of humans. I think the pandemic has been a really interesting conversation because there's a lot of people who aren't working right now because they've lost their jobs. And of course, there's this level of idea that they're worthless if they're not working, which is, of course, a beautiful capitalist idea. And it's really getting people to question, like, obviously, they inherently know they're not worthless because they have worked before. They have families they're taking care of, friends they're engaging with, and they're slowly starting to realize that perhaps their job is not their only, or their ability to work is not their only sense of worth. But it really makes you question, when we're talking about a large percentage of the disabled population is not working, not for lack of trying, but for lack of inaccessibility, or sometimes for lack of trying because sometimes people with disabilities have conditions where they need to rest. And I think the pandemic has shown the value of rest, especially when you're constantly in a fight or flight mode, which many people who are disabled are, because the world is horrific in many ways. And so fight or flight is very real. And I think this is the first time in a long, long time where we have an opportunity to help people understand, like, your worth isn't centered around this, neither is anybody else's.
That's a really good point.
But I don't think we're using
I remember hearing something on NPR a while back, maybe a year or so ago, about how work has become the religion of people in the United States. It's like the thing we find our self-worth in, our value in. And it's really scary for people when they get decoupled from that. Like they don't know who they are, you know?
It is scary.
Are there resources for people to engage like with anti-ableism? You know, I'm thinking this is bad to admit. I don't know who wrote the How to Be an Anti-Racist book.
Ibram Kendi.
Yeah. Thank you, Stomping Jen. Are there books like that? Because I think people, I mean, I know we have the problem of people probably not even recognizing that ableism is a thing, right? Like, I think a lot of people, if you say to them, do you know what racism is? They'll at least acknowledge they know what it is, right? I think a lot of people, don't even know what ableism is. And like, how can we begin engaging people to talk about this problem? Like, I'll confess, like, I'm not even sure I know how to talk about it in a way that is respectful to everybody, that, you know, because nobody taught me how.
You don't have the language.
I don't have the language. I don't have the toolkit. You know,
but also, you know, like I think that's true of a lot of things, you know, like I think that's true of race as well. It's true of gender in many ways. I think the reality is you're going to mess up. And I think that's part of owning it too, is like, if we didn't jump in and knowing that, you know, and dedicating to essentially doing the work, right? What we're doing in many other spaces, hopefully that everyone's engaging in, is like, you're going to mess up. And actually, if you don't, you're going to miss out on some really heavy learning opportunities that I think are in some ways more valuable than kind of doing it right, quote unquote. Because I know like growth happens in the discomfort. It just does. So like, if you mess up, you're certainly going to learn something, and you're probably going to internalize that, and you're going to do better next time because you've also learned a deeper reason as to why that was such a huge mess up. So I feel like it adds an extra layer of like taking the pressure off and like just going with the mindset, I'm going to do the best I can, and I'm going to actually put in time and effort, and I'm going to learn along the way. And you know what? Some people are just not going to like you. And that's just how it goes. And other people are going to be like, thank you. And like, I want to do this work with you. Or some people in the disability community are not going to thank you because they're going to be like, where the hell were you? And that's okay too, because I think we can all be asking ourselves the same question. Yeah. So I think it's just, you know, less about the gratitude from the disability community, or less about being seen as the correct ally and just working toward it instead.
Yeah.
I think that's the bigger thing.
So, for people, thank you for that. Yeah. And for people listening to this, what would, you know, sorry, this is going to sound stupid, Googling, anti-ableism resources. Is that a good place for people to kind of like start maybe?
You could do that. I think one place that I love, if people love podcasts, like if your podcast listeners are also lovers of other podcasts or this platform, this type of platform, there is a podcast called Disability Visibility. It's by Alice Wong. Highly recommend it. She's incredible. And the people who are on her show are incredible. They talk about really interesting topics. I think it's called Disability Visibility. Let me just double check, because there's a book also called Disability Visibility that is written. It's a whole bunch of stories by people who are disabled and a variety of experiences throughout the world. And she has like collected them and edited them. And it is like the best, most current single-handed depiction of disability across so many different ages, genders, different types of disabilities, cultures, etc. So I highly, highly recommend start with Disability Visibility. And there's another, if you, from an accessibility standpoint, of course, it costs money to access Disability Visibility as a book. There is a free plain language version. If you type in Disability Visibility plain language, it's like about, I want to say maybe 100 pages less. and it's language that's a bit easier to read and understand. But then there's also, if you go to the Disability Visibility Project, there's a book called Resistance and Hope, Essays by Disabled People, and that is completely free. And it's a really excellent book. I would start with those books or that podcast. And I would also watch Crypt Camp, which talks about it's a documentary on Netflix that really chronicles where the push for disability inclusion happened from like a human rights perspective in like 60s, 70s. And that kind of has a big focus on the work of Judy Heumann, who's a big advocate in the US for civil and human rights of people with disability. So the podcast is Disability Visibility Project. And then the book is Disability Visibility.
Yeah. And just for people listening, because internet audio sometimes sucks. Kelsey said Crip Camp. It's CRIPCAMP. And I've seen that documentary. I think it's on Netflix or Amazon, one of those places. You can see that.
It's
okay.
really good.
So start there, people listening to this.
Start there. And follow people on social media, especially follow people. There's this one way that we kind of, whenever I give talks on implicit bias, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. This is a good one. There's one thing that I always ask people to do, and, I'm starting a talk on ableism, and it's to really think about the closest 8 to 10 people in your life that are not family members. Who are your go-tos, right? Who do you confide in? Who do you trust? And just like take a second and just like on the top of your head, think about those 8 to 10 people, right? And then to go down the list and think, what are the genders of those people? Are they widely representing, the world today? What is the race of those different people that I consider? Are they all the same? Are they different? Same thing with ethnicity. And then thinking about disability. Does anyone in your 8 to 10 have a disability? And then just kind of like starting to think to yourself, if not, wow, we've got some work to do to really start broadening our perspective for wondering why the people we most trust and think about in our inner circle maybe look like us, maybe think like us, maybe talk like us, maybe walk like us. And it really starts to getting you to think, like what's going on here. And that can kind of be a helpful place to start as well. It's just like look inward, look around you. What does your world look like?
Yeah. And I'm thinking, and I like that as an exercise. And I'm thinking if you, hopefully these are people, like Kelsey said, they're people, your 8 closest friends. And this is going to be another stupid question. Like, is it, I'm assuming it's okay to ask a close friend this, but like, can you ask a person, do you have a disability you're dealing with that I should know about? Like, how can people ask that question? I guess, do you have a suggestion?
I think it depends on your relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, it totally depends on your relationship. So like, I know for like myself, if I'm, I guess I don't ever really ask it outright unless the situation would warrant it. And I think I just feel like for most people, it would come up if they felt comfortable talking about it with you. So I typically stay away from asking about it unless a certain specific situation warrants it, I guess. But I know one way that I find myself being able to help rid people of shame in talking about disability who might experience it. We know that a lot of people with invisible disabilities experience shame around disability or have difficulty talking about it because of ableism, inherent ableism. And so I find that if I sense, or if like someone's talking about something, that if I talk about my own disabilities more openly and kind of like putting it out there, then the conversation sometimes just happens on its own. And sometimes I've met plenty of people who haven't realized that what they have is in particular a disability related to a medical condition they have, or a series of disabilities that contribute to, their existence every day. And there are some enlightening moments in that too, and sometimes people seek a diagnosis, and sometimes people are like, well, this is just who I am, and this is how it goes, and this is how I'm living. But I guess I would never ask it, really. But I would offer up my own information.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a great thing to be thinking about. And I'm sorry, this just popped into my head. the most,
Yeah.
if there was one human emotion I could get rid of, it's shame. Like shame has fucked up my life, like in so many ways. Like,
Where did that come from?
Yeah.
I don't want to get into it here, but you know where it came from. Like, like just the shame, like unnecessary shame people feel like around everything, like bodily functions, sex, like you're standing in the world around ability, like, you know, like all that stuff. Like I hate shame.
Sorry.
No,
I'm not like laughing at you.
How dare you?
I'm just like
bearing my soul and you laughed.
Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah. But yeah, and I'm just thinking about that. Like, I think there's something in there, and we don't need to explore it now. But it's just
trauma. That thing is trauma.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's okay. It's trauma informs almost everything. So.
All right, let's lighten it up a little bit. You know, that was, I just,
you like threw like a heavy brick on there and now you want to lighten it up.
Me? Oh, the shame brick?
Yeah.
I did throw the shame brick. Do you want to shame me for that?
No.
Okay. So, Kelsey Hall, tell us, what do you like to do for fun? What do you like to do for fun? When you are not working to better the world, what do you like to do for fun?
Yeah. I mean, I really like a good meme session. So I have fallen down the pandemic meme scroll, but man, a good meme really gets me and it can cheer me up at any turn. But actual activities, that's like, I guess that can't really be a hobby. It's just a hole I fall down. But,
now I heard during this pandemic, you've been
hiking.
You told us you were hiking, but I heard you have been delving into watercolors.
Oh yeah.
Tell us about that.
I fell down a different hole of watercolors. So I was supposed to take a watercolor class. So I grew up doing art. I really love art. I never really deeply fostered this side of myself, and I'm still not doing it as deeply as I would like to, but I really just never, and this is probably capitalism, I'm going to bring it back to that, but I never went down that route because it just, wasn't quote unquote fruitful, but I love it. And I love painting. I used to paint with oil, then I moved to acrylic. And then I just, I follow this poet and artist named Mari Andrew, and she's lovely. And you should go check out her Instagram. And I was like, oh, watercolor is not something I've ever done. I would love to do watercolor. So I signed up last summer for a spring watercolor class. But of course, then the pandemic hit. Mm-hmm. And so they, because of everything at the time I was starting it, it was like really new, like it was fresh, like the pandemic stuff. And so everything was just shutting down in person. And so they didn't have time to like move everything online. And so they just refunded everyone, but I had bought all these supplies. So I was like, well, man, I just need to like rock it. So I just put a call out on Microsoft Teams to work. And I was like, hey, if you want me to paint your pet and maybe mess them up really badly, send me a photo and I'm going to just try to teach myself watercolors by painting all your pets. And they did. People sent pictures of their pets and I started learning how to watercolor my own pets and other people's. And then I sent out holiday cards of watercolored things I painted. And I love watercolor. It's so fun.
I've heard that is the hardest, the most difficult medium to master, mostly because of the white space. Like you really need to understand and have a really good grasp on negative space when you do watercolors. I don't know. That's what I heard.
I can't draw.
You know what's really funny? I think the hardest for me was oil, I would say. Acrylic is probably my easiest, but I feel like oil was always hard for me because it just felt so bloppy. I don't even know the word. I don't know. I just made that word up, but it just felt really bloppy. And it takes so long to dry. And then I would inevitably touch it and everything would get messed up underneath the dried layer on the top. And the weird thing was when I was in school, so I left high school early to do like dual enrollment for high school and college. And I was taking an art class when I did that in college. And I remember struggling really hard with some like painting some like still life things with oil and acrylic.
Yeah.
And I just remember the teacher said the most simplistic thing to me. And I was like, oh, and it was like my whole brain exploded. And I was like, oh, I get it now or something. And I'm still struggle with all of this, but like, it was the most single helpful thing. And all she said was just draw it like you see it. And I was like, what? Oh my God, brilliant. And so then I started, instead of like really worrying about like the gestalt image of something, I focused more specifically on like, well, what do I actually see?
Yeah.
And suddenly I could see the colors that they would constantly be saying about, because I was like, oh, like someone sees gray in this or purple. And I'm like, I don't see that. I just see like the gestalt image. But that was so helpful to me. And I've taken that with me everywhere. Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Get out of my own head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So I
awesome.
love a good watercolor. But that's good to hear, that maybe I'm thriving on watercolor over here.
That's awesome. I also understand a inside source has led me to understand that you've got a Peloton bike.
Oh yeah.
How's that going?
I did. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I know this is not the popular opinion for the show. I have found it to be incredibly helpful for anxiety for several reasons. One, so speaking of shame, I have lots of shame around like body image and all sorts of things. And I hate going to gyms. I hate exercise classes. I hate all of that stuff. Being on a Peloton can take all of that away from me because I love riding a bike. But I also will get deep anxiety sometimes about the thought of going out on my bike in places where there's traffic.
Yeah.
So I love the bike path, but at the same time, there's a lot of people on the bike path. So the Peloton has provided me like an opportunity to be in the safety of my own home while still being guided by someone who knows more than I do. But to also feel like I'm getting some amount of endorphins for when my anxiety is massively high, which in the last year has been out of control sometimes. So I love it for that reason. I don't have to go anywhere for it. If it's not a day I actually can get on my physical bike, I can do that. Some days it keeps me from having to take my meds. So I don't know. I love it.
Congratulations. That's awesome. And for the record, I was never against Pelotons. It was Stomping Jen.
No, I'm not a spinner. I don't spin.
Okay.
And I don't run. I do,
I don't run
however, very much enjoy group exercise classes.
Oh,
and
so listen to this, Kelsey Hall. Listen to this. Stomping Jen does these online classes from this woman we know in Belchertown named Lisa Stahl, and you don't have to have your camera on,
No,
and it's like
you
group.
can't. She does a Facebook Live, so it's one way instruction.
It's Stomping Jen is
it's
up
super
there.
affordable, and you could take it for up to 6 days after it's live recorded. But like, so yeah, go ahead.
We'll send you the link. And this my co-host here gets me out of bed at 7. She kicks me out of the bedroom, and she does these exercises at 7:30 in the morning.
Oh my God.
But you can do them at any time. And you love it, Stomping Jen.
But I mean,
7:30.
pre-pandemic, I very much.
You love the classes.
For me, and this is only my experience with exercise, is I need somebody to tell me to do it, right? So I need that accountability. Like even with like, I have an accountability partner that like I go for walks with, but like if she and I...
Oh, I thought you were talking about me. I'm not your accountability partner?
No, but like, she and I go for walks, but if she can't, if our schedules don't mesh up, like sometimes in the morning, if she'll yells at me, like, you should go for a walk, like I'll get it in my head, like, okay, I will go for a walk. But if she doesn't yell at me and she'll be like, oh, I walked. I'm like, oh, you didn't tell me to walk. So
sounds like a codependent accountability partner.
Well, it's been very helpful for these last couple of months. Yeah. But before this, I really enjoyed the group exercise classes, as I mentioned. But I understand that a lot of people don't like them for that very same reason. Like, but it's something very freeing about like the accessibility of having a group instructor where they can't see you and you're not with a bunch of people, and then you can, you can let go a little bit, like,
yeah,
if you
absolutely.
catch my
No, totally. I mean, like,
yeah, I'll burp or whatever, and I'm just like, nobody's here, nobody cares,
Exactly. And like how like loud I can sing along to the songs that they choose for the playlist. But like, and also for anyone else who has a Peloton or whatever, like, or if they just like subscribe to the exercise classes and things, like, I love being like, yeah, I'll meet you on the bike at this time.
Yeah.
And like, we'll take this class. Or,
exactly.
But like you can pick and choose, or you can just not talk to anybody and like just ignore everyone, which is great. It's just like, yeah. It's been really helpful.
I mean, it does when I listen to people like you speak about it, like I do like enjoy riding a bike on the bike path.
Yeah.
It's so nice.
Just going out there.
Yeah.
All right. So,
okay. Sorry.
All right. So,
we're going down a rabbit hole.
Increased artistic expression, the Peloton.
Right.
So there's a trend here with healthier living.
Yeah.
And you revealed to me also that it's been like around a year or so since you pretty much stopped drinking, right? A sobriety kind of anniversary.
Yeah. And it's like, woo.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating because it's like not necessarily something that I did for any particular reason. My partner he doesn't drink either. And like going into a pandemic year, I was reading this thing where it was like, well, you're either going to come out drunk or you're going to come out really good bread maker. And I was like, I totally want to be on the bread side.
Yeah. Team bread.
And I just, team bread all the way. But we had been not drinking since like last fall. And I think going into this pandemic, it was really fascinating. At first, I was like, what is going to come of this? What is going to come of this? And because of where I work, I found out pretty deeply about the pandemic starting in like the end of December, early January, and that it could become a really big thing. And so I was like already starting to kind of crack down on certain things. I had like procured some certain things for myself because I was like, because I was still traveling for work at that time, like with a lot of uncertainty. And I spent a lot of time thinking about like, what if we were to be locked down? What if? And I was like, I don't want to drink. I don't want to focus on any of those things. And I also, what an opportunity to cut some people out of my life that are just toxic.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. Couldn't see anybody. This was a perfect time for people with really bad anxiety to say see you later to some people that didn't serve them, that they didn't feel like they could serve. So I did that too.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
I'm sitting at 327 days, and thanks.
Woo!
And I'll give myself one of these.
Oh yeah.
Yay! And my journey started accidentally somewhat too. I got sick. Like I got and who knows, maybe I had COVID early on, but I got like in February. No, it was like January, February. I got really, really sick.
It's January.
And I was just like, I cannot drink and take medicine. And I was drinking like a really unhealthy amount. And I just was like, and I had been like questioning myself, and I did a whole not like half-hour podcast on this. People can go back and listen to it, but I was just like, I've got to make changes in my life, and it's been like a really good positive thing for me.
It's so weird, because when I think about, like, I don't talk about it because I stopped drinking also, but like you talk about it all the time.
Well, because I could go on about why, but go ahead.
But like, it's interesting because, like you just said, we were drinking an unhealthy amount. We were doing it together. It wasn't like you were doing it and I wasn't doing it. We were both doing it together. And then we had a discussion about it, actually, I think on the air. And then I got this book that my therapist had recommended like a year prior. And for me, it literally just flipped a switch in my brain. So like I have no desire to drink any longer.
What's really interesting, right, is I think we were both going down these parallel tracks of questioning our own drinking behaviors and not talking to each other about it. Like, and then I think, I don't know what happened. I don't know if you stopped first, but it was like
no,
right
you
around.
Stopped first.
I did. Okay. And I was just like, I said to you, I'm like, I don't want to do this. I'm getting concerned about like thinking about drinking all the time, because I was like, I would be thinking like in the morning, starting to think about what am I going to drink later tonight. I was like,
do we have alcohol?
And
in
once
the
that
house?
happened, I was like, there's a fucking problem here and I need to stop. Like, and then so I'd been thinking that way for a couple of weeks. And then when I got sick, I was like, okay, I'm using this. This is going to be
time to stop.
This is going to be my springboard. And, you know, and like Stomping Jen said, it has flipped multiple switches in my brain. Like,
yeah, it had more of an impact, I think, on you for your.
I struggle with generalized anxiety disorder to begin with, and I didn't realize. Yeah, I did not realize how badly alcohol was exacerbating that. And it's
big time.
It's like somebody. I know. I don't want to talk about that as something that needs to be fixed if it works for somebody, but for me, it was having really negative consequences in my life. And so having that diminish
it took you off the cycle.
Yeah.
The like not manic.
No, I was manic.
Well, you were at times.
Yeah,
but like,
I was.
you know, anyways.
Yeah. Anyways. And so, yeah. So I'm really happy.
So it's had more of an impact and a benefit for you. But then I think the other thing, so I don't know if this happened to you and your partner, Kelsey, but like for us, there was a huge mental transition, not around the alcohol itself, but around the cultural society and its view on alcohol and adjusting all of our mindset around that. And I feel like it's less of a struggle maybe because we don't see people so much anymore socially. So it's a little bit easier to compartmentalize that. But, you know, a lot of, you know, when the pandemic hit and all the people talking about drinking to cope with, you know, the pandemic and just, you know,
absolutely,
it was so prevalent and so in your face. And like, it's like you take the blue pill or the red pill or the whatever pill that the Matrix.
Did you do the sourdough or did you drink? Yeah.
Right.
Like it's basically what it came down to.
Yeah.
But you're so right. Like I totally agree. There are certain things. I also have a pretty significant anxiety disorder, and I know that things that really impact it are alcohol and caffeine, and lots of other things. But I also know the things that help it. And for me, it's like riding the Peloton, doing something mindless, like literally just like describing the environment around myself at any given moment to just ground myself so I don't have a panic attack. But I think to what you were saying before too, like your opportunity to kind of just go head first in this when you got sick, like the pandemic in a lot of ways was that springboard, I think, for me and for many other people in some ways, but like to just be like, yep, we're gung ho, not drinking. And then realizing that drinking in a lot of ways was a crutch to allow toxic people to maintain their presence in my life.
Yeah.
And realizing that now I can't see those toxic people because it's like legit illegal. And that was great because it just like got them away from me. And then it also was like, oh, and I'm not drinking because that's what I used to do with them to cope that I was with them. And so it just like was a cycle that I was like starting to unpack and just being like, wow, it's great to just remove certain things that are just not serving you and to feel like unapologetically happy.
That's awesome. I'm so happy for you. Okay, last question thank you. Last question before we wrap up. And you can interpret this any what?
Nothing.
Stomping Jen knows what I'm about to ask you.
He's already switched the board around.
Okay.
All right. What have you seen that you cannot explain?
What have I seen that I cannot explain?
If it's nothing, that's fine. If you can explain everything, that's totally okay.
It's not the nature of people, right? To explain everything away into like it making sense. How about I just like, what have I seen? Can it be like in a dream?
Yeah, it could be anything. That's the beauty of this question.
So
Stomping Jen will judge you for your answer. Stomping Jen will judge you for your answer. I will not, just by the way.
Okay. Well, I've been thinking about this dream that I recently had that was like really haunting.
Go on.
And it was just so strange. It was like a family member's sister like that I don't know. Like we bought a house this year early, like in the midst of the pandemic, and in my dream I was like in this house, but it wasn't this house, as dreams always go, right? Yeah. And I was sleeping and my partner had woken up, and he like ran upstairs after going downstairs, and he was like, you have to come down here, and I like walked downstairs into what I was going to think was going to be our house. And it was like completely rearranged with this family member's sister, all of her things. And just like, it was just like the weirdest, I guess I can't explain it, because it was the weirdest thing that I've seen. And just, I think the secondary part of this where, there's like a tow truck that he had called because they were saying that she was also dead. So she had like come into our home and like rearranged all of the furniture and added her own furniture, and then like stood it up in such a way. And that when I walked downstairs, I was just like, what? It was like, it was both haunting and just like unbelievable. So I literally can't explain it. And then the dream continued, but it was just a nightmare. So that's been on my mind, like an insane, abnormal amount for a dream that happened like several days ago, or 3 or 4 days ago. And I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a very long time. And I feel like I need to call that family member, because it was so haunting.
Wow.
And the dream ended with me going to try to find them, like my family that this person's related to like tell them this happened. And the dream ends with me like running up and down the stairs of this like very large apartment complex. And on one of the floors, hearing my uncle say, we're down here in room 916. And that was it. Or 619. And that was it. And I was like running towards 619 and I woke up.
Room 619. So, what's in room 619?
I don't know. I got to find it though.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I appreciate it. Anyway. No, that was great. Thank you.
Can't explain it.
I love asking people that question. So welcome. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
It's almost been 2 hours. I first need to say, before we wrap up, thank you, Kelsey Hall, for coming on and talking to us about accessibility, disability, ableism, anti-ableism. That's an important thing to emphasize. Anti-ableism. Okay. All of you listening out here can do something about this. Okay.
Yeah.
Get on it.
Big time.
So thank you, thank you, Kelsey Hall.
Thank you.
Stomping Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Me?
You're continuing to prove that you're the right co-host for me.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you. As always.
Anything I can do for you.
To our fans, yes. I would be remiss if I did not mention you. I'll say it like I do every week. I love you. Thank you for listening. Stomping Jen, what would you like to say?
Subscribe, download, share with a friend.
Once again, no love from Stomping Jen. That's fine.
Why can't you speak for both of us?
I only speak for me.
Oh my Jesus. Okay.
All right. Well, this is your chance.
We love you.
Be healthy. That sounded very
wear a mask.
Sounded
Get
very
vaccinated.
Sounded very insincere. Very insincere. Mine was sincere. Okay.
Don't shame me.
Oh.
All
right. This is for me shaming you. All right. No shaming allowed, right?
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, people. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, download, leave us a review, and we'll see you on the next one, right?
Yep.
Okay. Kelsey Hall, do you want to say bye?
I want to say, please come sit at our table and do some anti-ableism work with us. And goodbye. And I love you too.
All right. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed